The Christmas Tree. The week before Christmas, the 7 dwarfs were returning home from a long day's work in their diamond mine. They had toiled hard through the cold winter air, chipping away at the sparkling jewels deep inside the earth. As they approached their little cottage nestled at the edge of the forest, they noticed something different. Through the frosted windows, they could see their dear friend, Snow White, busy at work inside. The air outside was crisp, and the forest was blanketed in a soft layer of snow. As they stepped inside, they were greeted by the sweet scent of pine and the cheerful sight of Snow White pinning sprigs of holly, mistletoe, and ivy onto the walls of their cottage. The glow from the fire in the hearth flickered warmly, casting a cozy light across the room. Snow White looked up with a gentle smile. "I always did this at home," she sighed, her voice carrying a touch of nostalgia. "And we used to have a lovely Christmas tree covered in sparkling baubles." The dwarfs paused for a moment, each of them remembering their friend's troubled past before they saw the wistful look in her eyes. It was clear that she was longing for the joy of those Christmases from her childhood, before her wicked stepmother's cruelty had forced her to flee the castle. Dopey, ever the sensitive one, was the first to notice the tear that glistened in Snow White's eye. He patted her gently on the shoulder, his heart full of concern for her. "Don't worry, Snow White," he seemed to say with a hopeful grin. Later that evening, after Snow White had retired to her bed, the dwarfs gathered around the warm fire, their heads huddled together in a secretive conference. They were determined to make this Christmas special for Snow White, no matter what it took. "We'll go into the woods early tomorrow morning and cut down a fine fir tree," cried Doc, his glasses gleaming in the firelight. "That will cheer Snow White up." "Absolutely," chuckled Happy, bouncing up and down with excitement. "Snow White shall have a Christmas tree just like she remembers from her home." His enthusiasm was contagious, and the dwarves found themselves nodding eagerly in agreement. "But we haven't any sparkling baubles to hang on it," murmured Bashful, his face turning pink as he looked down at his boots, unsure how they could manage to make the tree as beautiful as Snow White remembered. "That's true," yawned Sleepy, scratching his head as he stretched out on the floor. "Achoo." Sneezy suddenly sneezed, sending a cloud of dust up into the air. "I know we can string some of our diamonds into a chain. They are very sparkling." He gave a proud little sniff, pleased with his idea. "Rubbish, humbug," Grumpy grumbled from the corner, shaking his head. "How's that going to work? Diamonds are too heavy to hang from a tree. They'll just fall right off." But despite his grousing, Grumpy joined the others in their preparations the next morning. He might not have been enthusiastic, but he wouldn't let his friends down. Together, the dwarfs set out on their quest. As the dawn broke and the sky turned soft pink and gold, the dwarfs tramped into the snowy forest. They trekked through the thick trees, their boots crunching in the snow, until they found the perfect tree, a tall, majestic fir with long, spiky branches that seemed to shimmer with frost. "This one," Doc declared triumphantly, wiping the frost from his glasses. "This is the one for Snow White." The dwarfs worked together to chop down the tree. It took some effort, but eventually they managed to fell it. They could hardly wait to bring it home. Puffing and panting with the weight of the enormous tree, they dragged it through the snow, over hills and around winding paths, finally arriving back at the cottage. But when they reached the door, their excitement turned to disappointment. The tree was simply too big. No matter how hard they tried, it wouldn't fit through the narrow door of the cottage. "What are we going to do?" Bashful asked, his voice filled with despair as he stared at the tree. "We can't bring it inside." Snow White, having heard the commotion, rushed out of the cottage, concern written on her face. "Goodness," she exclaimed, seeing the large tree standing awkwardly in the doorway. "What are you doing?" Doc looked thoroughly miserable. "We brought you a Christmas tree, Snow White, but it's too big. We didn't mean to disappoint you." Snow White smiled softly, wiping the tear from Dopey's cheek. "Oh, you dear, sweet dwarfs," she said warmly, her eyes sparkling. "This tree is beautiful. I have a wonderful idea." She glanced around and pointed to the patch of earth just outside the cottage. "Why don't you stand it up in the ground outside? That way we can look at it through the window and enjoy it from here." Happy laughed with delight. "What a marvelous idea. Come on, men," he called, and together they carefully planted the tree in the earth, making sure it stood tall and proud. As evening fell and the sky turned dark, the dwarfs set to work decorating the tree. They draped strings of diamonds across its branches, and, as the stars began to twinkle above, they placed candles on the tree. The soft glow of the flames danced on the icy branches, casting flickering shadows onto the snow-covered ground. The dwarfs stood back, admiring their handiwork. The diamonds sparkled like 1,000 stars, and the candles added a warm glow to the cold night. It was a Christmas tree like no other. "Is it like the trees you had, Snow White?" they asked shyly, watching her face for any sign of disappointment. Snow White looked at the tree, her eyes wide with wonder. "No," she said with a radiant smile. "It's much, much lovelier. Thank you for such a splendid Christmas present." She reached out to hug each of the dwarves, her heart full of gratitude. "This is the most beautiful tree I've ever seen. It means so much to me." The dwarfs beamed with pride. They had succeeded in making Snow White's Christmas special, and the warmth in their hearts was brighter than any bauble could ever be. Together, they stood, side by side, watching the sparkling tree through the window, knowing that this would be a Christmas neither they nor Snow White would ever forget.